You sabotage your own success every single day and don't even realize it's happening. Every argument you win costs you a relationship. Every time you prove you're right, you prove you're alone. And every moment you spend defending your ego is a moment you could have spent actually growing. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying human nature, teaching millions of people how to influence others and build meaningful connections. What I discovered about ego will shock you. It's not your confidence or self-worth that's holding you back. It's the invisible enemy that masquerades as both. The ego principles I'll share will transform how you see yourself and dramatically improve every relationship in your life. The same insights that helped me write How to Win Friends and Influence People can free you from the prison of your own ego. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to conquer their greatest enemy. I was 24 years old when I received a letter that would change my life forever. It wasn't a love letter or a job offer. It was a rejection so brutal, so honest, that it shattered every illusion I had about myself. The prospective client didn't just say no to my sales pitch. He told me exactly why I had failed, and his words cut deeper than any knife. Mr. Carnegie, the letter read, your presentation was impressive in its thoroughness, but you spent the entire meeting trying to convince me how smart you were instead of understanding what I actually needed. You were so busy proving your worth that you never once asked what would make my business better. I felt like you were selling to yourself, not to me. I read those words over and over, my face burning with embarrassment and anger. My first instinct was to defend myself, to write back and explain why he was wrong, why he had misunderstood my approach. I actually started drafting that defensive response 3 different times, but something stopped me each time. A small voice that whispered what I didn't want to hear. He was absolutely right. For years, I had been walking into every interaction with one primary goal: to prove how impressive I was. In sales meetings, I would overwhelm prospects with my knowledge. In social situations, I would dominate conversations with stories that showcased my achievements. When someone shared a problem, I would immediately jump in with advice that demonstrated my wisdom. I thought I was being helpful, valuable, engaging. In reality, I was being insufferable. The painful truth was that I had become so focused on managing other people's perception of me that I had forgotten to actually connect with them. I was performing Dale Carnegie instead of being Dale Carnegie. Every conversation had become a stage where I was the star performer, and everyone else was simply an audience to impress. I began to notice patterns in my behavior that I had been blind to before. When someone else was telling a story, I would be thinking about my own story to tell next. When a colleague shared an idea, my immediate response was to improve it or build upon it, making sure everyone knew I had something valuable to add. When I made a mistake, I would spend enormous energy explaining the circumstances rather than simply acknowledging the error. The most humbling realization came when I started paying attention to how people responded to me. I noticed the glazed look in their eyes when I launched into my impressive speeches. I saw how quickly they found excuses to end conversations. I watched as they turned to others for advice, even when I was clearly the most qualified person in the room. I had been operating under the dangerous assumption that if people were impressed by me, they would like me and want to do business with me. But I was learning that the opposite was true. The harder I tried to impress, the more I repelled. The more I tried to prove my worth, the less valuable I actually became to others. This revelation forced me to confront an uncomfortable question. If my approach wasn't working, what was? I began to observe the people who seemed naturally magnetic, who drew others to them effortlessly. What I discovered was revolutionary in its simplicity. They were genuinely interested in other people, rather than trying to make other people interested in them. I started a small experiment. For 1 week, I would enter every conversation with the goal of learning something about the other person, rather than teaching them something about me. The results were immediate and astonishing. People began to light up when they talked to me. They stayed longer in conversations. They actually sought me out for advice and collaboration. My ego had been like a suit of armor that I thought was protecting me, but it was actually isolating me from the very connections I desperately wanted to make. Asterisk, the most dangerous thing about ego is how perfectly it disguises itself as virtue. For years, I believed my ego was actually my strength, my confidence, my self-respect, my drive to succeed. I wore my ego like a badge of honor, thinking it was what separated me from the weak and the mediocre. What I didn't realize was that I was living in an invisible prison, and my ego was both the warden and the bars. The difference between healthy self-worth and destructive ego became clear to me through a painful experience at a dinner party. I had been invited to speak about my early business ventures, and I arrived feeling quite pleased with myself. Here was my chance to shine, to demonstrate my expertise to a room full of influential people. As the evening progressed, I found myself dominating every conversation. When someone mentioned a challenge in their business, I immediately launched into a detailed explanation of how I had solved a similar problem. When another guest shared an accomplishment, I couldn't help but share a bigger one of my own. I thought I was being helpful, valuable, impressive, but as the night wore on, I noticed something troubling. People began to avoid me. Conversations would die when I approached. Eyes would glaze over when I started speaking. By the end of the evening, I was standing alone while animated discussions flourished on the other side of the room. Later, a trusted friend pulled me aside with feedback that stung. "Dale, you're obviously brilliant and accomplished, but tonight you made everyone else feel small. Every story they told reminded you of a bigger story. Every problem they shared became an opportunity for you to show off your solutions. You didn't have conversations tonight, you gave lectures." This was my first glimpse into the invisible prison of ego. I had been so focused on proving my importance that I had made everyone else feel unimportant. My ego wasn't confidence, it was insecurity dressed up in fancy clothes. True confidence would have allowed me to celebrate others, to ask questions, to learn something new. Instead, my ego had turned every interaction into a performance where I had to be the star. I began to understand that ego is fundamentally about comparison and competition. It can't simply be good. It must be better than others. It can't just succeed, must succeed more visibly than everyone else. This constant measuring creates an exhausting internal narrative where every conversation becomes a contest, and every interaction becomes a test of worth. The smartest people often struggle most with ego, precisely because their intelligence has been rewarded throughout their lives. Teachers praised them, bosses promoted them, friends sought their advice. But this reinforcement can create a dangerous assumption that their worth comes from being the smartest person in the room. When that identity is threatened, ego springs into action to defend it. I realized that my need to always be right had cost me countless opportunities to learn. How many times had someone tried to share an insight with me, only to have me immediately correct or improve upon it? How many conversations had I missed because I was too busy preparing my next impressive comment? How many relationships had I damaged by making others feel inferior? The cost of ego isn't just external, it's internal too. Living in constant performance mode is exhausting. Always having to prove yourself means never being able to rest in your own worth. Always needing to be impressive means never being able to be genuine. The prison of ego doesn't just lock others out, it locks your authentic self in. Asterisk, I lost one of the most valuable friendships of my early career because I couldn't stop trying to be interesting long enough to be interested. His name was Robert, and he was everything I thought I wanted to be: successful, well-connected, naturally charismatic. When we first met at a business conference, I saw an opportunity to impress someone who could open doors for me. From our very first conversation, I made the classic ego mistake. I focused entirely on making myself look good, rather than making him feel good. When he mentioned a challenge his company was facing, I immediately launched into a detailed analysis of what he should do, complete with examples from my own experience. When he talked about his recent vacation, I shared stories of my more exotic travels. When he mentioned reading a book, I couldn't help but recommend 3 better ones I had read. I thought I was being engaging and valuable. In reality, I was being exhausting and self-centered. Every response I gave redirected the conversation back to me. Every question he asked became an opportunity for me to showcase my knowledge or experience. I was like a mirror that only reflected myself. What I didn't understand then was that ego makes us focus on being interesting instead of being interested. And this fundamental misunderstanding destroys relationships before they can even begin. People don't bond with you because you impress them. They bond with you because you make them feel understood, valued, and important. Robert was patient with me for several months. He would invite me to lunch, include me in group discussions, even recommend me for speaking opportunities. But gradually, I noticed the invitations becoming less frequent. The warm enthusiasm in his voice began to cool. Eventually, our interactions became purely professional and superficial. The breaking point came during a group dinner where Robert was sharing a personal struggle with his teenage son. Instead of simply listening and offering support, I immediately jumped in with parenting advice, complete with examples of how I had handled similar situations with young people in my classes. I watched his face change as I spoke. The openness disappeared, replaced by polite but distant politeness. After dinner, he pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "Dale, you're clearly knowledgeable and well-meaning, but you have this way of making every conversation about you. Tonight I was looking for a friend to listen, and instead, I got a consultant who wanted to fix me. I don't need another advisor. I need genuine connection." Those words hit me like a physical blow because they were absolutely true. I had been so focused on demonstrating my value that I had forgotten to offer what people actually wanted: authentic human connection. My ego had convinced me that my worth came from having the right answers. But what Robert needed wasn't answers. He needed someone to simply be present with him in his struggle. This revelation helped me understand why ego-driven people often feel lonely despite being surrounded by people. We create relationships based on performance rather than authenticity. People interact with our persona, not our person. They appreciate our advice, but don't trust us with their vulnerabilities. They're impressed by our accomplishments, but don't feel safe sharing their struggles. Ego prevents genuine listening because it's always preparing its next performance. While someone is sharing their heart, ego is already formulating its response. The perfect story, the brilliant insight, the helpful advice. But real listening requires setting ego aside and creating space for another person's experience without immediately trying to match it, fix it, or improve upon it. I began to notice how ego-driven behavior repels people in subtle but powerful ways. When someone shares good news and you immediately share your own good news, you steal their moment. When someone expresses uncertainty and you rush to provide answers, you rob them of the process of discovery. When someone shows vulnerability and you respond with your own story, you make their courage about your experience. The human need to feel important is so fundamental that Dale Carnegie, the one people remember, built his entire philosophy around it. But ego-driven people reverse this principle. Instead of making others feel important, they use others to make themselves feel important. Instead of drawing people out, they push themselves forward. Instead of creating connection, they create competition. Through years of studying my own behavior and observing others, I discovered that ego doesn't just have one face. It has three distinct personalities that work together to keep us trapped in self-centered thinking. Each face is sophisticated in its own way, and each one convinced me it was actually helping me succeed when it was systematically destroying my relationships and opportunities. The first face is the defensive ego, and it was the one I knew best. This is the part of ego that treats every piece of feedback like a personal attack and every mistake like a threat to your identity. I remember a presentation I gave early in my career, where a colleague afterward suggested I had talked too fast and lost the audience in the middle section. My defensive ego immediately sprang into action. Instead of simply saying thank you for the feedback, I found myself explaining why I had talked quickly, the time constraints, the complex material, the importance of covering all the points. Then I began defending the middle section, explaining why it was actually crucial and how the audience would understand its value once they had time to think about it. By the time I finished my defensive explanation, what started as helpful feedback had become an argument. The defensive ego convinced me that accepting criticism meant admitting weakness, and admitting weakness meant losing respect. So it taught me to deflect, explain, and justify every mistake rather than simply acknowledging it and moving forward. What I didn't realize was that this constant defensiveness made me exhausting to work with and impossible to coach. The second face is the competitive ego, which turns every conversation into a contest and every interaction into a measurement. This was the part of me that couldn't let someone else have a good story without having a better one, couldn't let someone else shine without trying to shine brighter. I saw this most clearly during a business meeting where a younger colleague shared an innovative idea that impressed everyone in the room. Instead of celebrating his insight and building upon it, my competitive ego immediately started working to find a way to improve his idea or share a similar but better idea of my own. I couldn't just let him have his moment. I had to make sure everyone knew I was equally valuable. The competitive ego operates on the false belief that there's only a limited amount of success, recognition, and respect to go around. If someone else succeeds, that somehow diminishes my chances of succeeding. If someone else gets praised, that means less praise available for me. This scarcity thinking turns potential allies into competitors and transforms collaborative opportunities into zero-sum games. The third face is the superior ego, which is perhaps the most insidious because it disguises itself as helpfulness and wisdom. This is the part that needs to be the smartest person in the room, the one with the best advice, the expert who can solve everyone else's problems. On the surface, it looks generous and valuable. Underneath, it's about positioning yourself above others. I recognized this face in my tendency to immediately offer solutions when people shared problems with me. Someone would mention struggling with time management, and I would launch into a detailed explanation of the system I used. A friend would express frustration with a difficult colleague, and I would analyze the situation and provide a step-by-step approach to handling it. I thought I was being helpful, but what I was actually doing was positioning myself as the one with answers while making them the one with problems. I was creating a subtle hierarchy where I was the teacher and they were the student. I was the expert and they were the novice. This dynamic might boost my ego, but it didn't build genuine relationships. These three faces work together in sophisticated ways. When someone challenges an idea from my superior ego, my defensive ego jumps in to protect it. When someone else gets recognition, my competitive ego starts working to reclaim the spotlight, which triggers my superior ego to demonstrate why I deserve that recognition. The most damaging aspect of these three faces is how they prevent authentic connection. Real relationships require vulnerability, curiosity, and the ability to let others shine. But the defensive ego can't be vulnerable, because that feels unsafe. The competitive ego can't be curious, because that might reveal someone else knows something you don't. The superior ego can't let others shine, because that threatens its position above them. I began to see how these three faces isolated me from the very connections I was trying to create. People could sense, even if they couldn't articulate, that every interaction with me had an agenda. I wasn't just being friendly, I was protecting my image, competing for status, or positioning myself as superior. Even when my intentions were good, my ego's agenda contaminated the interaction. The breakthrough came when I realized that all three faces were based on the same fundamental error, the belief that my worth came from external validation rather than internal wholeness. Once I began to find my security in something deeper than other people's opinions, I could finally afford to let them be right, let them shine, and let them teach me something new. Nothing revealed the ugly face of my ego quite like criticism. I could be having a perfectly pleasant day, feeling confident and capable, and then someone would offer even the gentlest suggestion for improvement. Suddenly, I would transform into a defensive, argumentative version of myself that I barely recognized. I kept a collection box on my desk where I stored the harshest feedback I received, not because I enjoyed the pain, but because I was fascinated by my own reactions to it. One piece of criticism that I studied repeatedly came from a student after one of my early public speaking classes. She wrote, "Mr. Carnegie, your content is excellent, but you speak so quickly when you're nervous that it's hard to follow. Also, you have a habit of saying you know every few sentences, which is distracting." When I first read those words, I felt my face flush with heat. My immediate thought wasn't thank you for helping me improve. It was how dare she criticize me when she can barely string 2 sentences together herself. I actually spent 20 minutes mentally rehearsing all the reasons why her feedback was invalid, unfair, and unhelpful. But then I forced myself to really listen to what she had said. She wasn't attacking my character or questioning my expertise. She was simply pointing out specific behaviors that made it harder for her to learn from me. Her criticism was actually a gift. She was telling me exactly how to be more effective in helping my students. This experience taught me that ego interprets all criticism as personal attacks, because it can't distinguish between behavior and identity. When someone criticizes what I do, ego hears them criticizing who I am. When someone suggests I could improve something, ego hears them saying I'm inadequate. This confusion between actions and identity is what makes criticism feel so threatening to our sense of self. I began to notice the physiological response that happened whenever my ego felt threatened by criticism. My heart would race, my breathing would become shallow, and my mind would immediately start generating defenses and counterattacks. It was as if someone had pressed an alarm button in my nervous system, triggering a fight or flight response to what was often just helpful feedback. The most destructive part of this ego response was how it prevented me from actually hearing and learning from legitimate criticism. Instead of listening to understand how I could improve, I was listening to defend and rebut, instead of asking clarifying questions to better understand the feedback. I was formulating explanations for why the criticism wasn't valid. I started experimenting with a different approach. Instead of my automatic defensive response, I began to say thank you for the feedback immediately, before my ego had time to construct its defenses. This simple phrase, buying me precious seconds to separate the criticism from my identity and consider whether there might be truth in what I was hearing. The transformation was remarkable. When I stopped treating critics as enemies and started treating them as unpaid consultants, I began to receive incredibly valuable insights about my blind spots. My speaking improved dramatically when I actually listened to feedback about my pace and filler words. My teaching became more effective when I paid attention to comments about what students found confusing. But perhaps the most powerful shift came when I learned to thank critics instead of defending against them. I discovered that people who take the time to give you honest feedback are actually doing you a tremendous favor. Most people will simply smile politely and never tell you about the spinach in your teeth, metaphorically speaking. The ones who care enough to risk your displeasure by pointing out your weaknesses are rare and valuable. Asterisk, if criticism triggers my ego's alarm system. Justification was its favorite weapon of choice. I kept a detailed journal of my daily excuses, and what I discovered about my own pattern of justification was both fascinating and horrifying. My ego had become a master storyteller, spinning elaborate narratives that explained away every failure, mistake, and shortcoming while carefully preserving my self-image. The most painful example came from my biggest professional failure in those early years. I had been hired to develop a training program for a large corporation, and after 3 months of work, they cancelled the contract and asked me to leave. It was devastating, both financially and emotionally, but instead of examining what had gone wrong, my ego immediately went to work creating a story that protected me from responsibility. In my initial version of events, the company was disorganized and didn't understand the value of what I was offering. The managers were threatened by my expertise and worried that I would make them look bad. The employees were resistant to change and couldn't appreciate innovative approaches. The timing was wrong because of budget constraints and internal politics. My ego crafted a detailed narrative where I was the competent professional victimized by incompetent clients. For months, I told this story to anyone who would listen. I genuinely believed it. My ego had done such a thorough job of justification that I couldn't see past my own narrative to the actual truth. It wasn't until a trusted mentor sat me down and asked some uncomfortable questions that I began to crack through my wall of justification. "Dale," he said, "I've heard your story about what happened with that contract, but I'm curious if you could do that project over again. Would you do anything differently?" My immediate response was no. I did everything right. They just weren't ready for it. But he persisted. "Nothing, not even small adjustments to how you presented ideas or structured the program." Those questions forced me to confront the difference between explanation and justification. An explanation acknowledges reality and takes responsibility while identifying what happened. Justification, on the other hand, rewrites reality to preserve ego and avoid responsibility. I had been so busy justifying that I hadn't bothered to actually learn from the experience. When I finally set aside my ego's protective narrative and honestly examined what had happened, I discovered several crucial mistakes I had made. I had designed the program based on what I thought they needed rather than asking what they actually wanted. I had presented my ideas in ways that made their current methods look foolish instead of building on their existing strengths. I had been so focused on proving my expertise that I hadn't bothered to understand their culture and constraints. Most damaging of all, when early feedback suggested the program wasn't landing well, I had dismissed it as resistance to change rather than adjusting my approach. My ego had convinced me that any criticism of my program was evidence of their limitations, not mine. This justification prevented me from course-correcting when there was still time to save the project. I begun to notice how ego's justification machine operated in smaller daily situations. When I arrived late to a meeting, my ego would immediately generate explanations about unexpected traffic rather than acknowledging poor time management. When a student seemed disengaged in my class, my ego would blame their attitude rather than examining whether my teaching methods were connecting. When a social interaction felt awkward, my ego would focus on the other person's social skills rather than considering my own contribution to the dynamic. The most insidious aspect of justification is how it prevents growth. Every time ego explains away a failure or mistake, it robs you of the opportunity to learn from it. Every time it blames external circumstances for your problems, it keeps you powerless to create better outcomes. Justification feels good in the moment because it protects your self-image, but it's actually a form of self-sabotage that ensures you'll repeat the same mistakes. Breaking the cycle of justification required developing what I came to think of as responsibility, the ability to respond to situations. By examining my own role and choices, rather than immediately looking for external explanations. When something went wrong, instead of asking what happened to me, I learned to ask, what did I contribute to this outcome? This shift from justification to genuine responsibility was terrifying at first because it meant acknowledging my mistakes and limitations, but it was also liberating because it gave me power to create different results. Once I stopped explaining away my failures, I could finally learn from them and avoid repeating them. My early attempts at leadership were disasters, and I have a file full of documentation to prove it. I kept detailed records of my management failures because I was determined to understand why my teams consistently underperformed, despite having capable people and clear objectives. What I discovered was that my ego had turned me into the kind of leader I would have hated working for. The most humbling example occurred when I was managing a team of instructors for a series of public speaking workshops. On paper, everything should have worked perfectly. I had recruited talented people, provided thorough training materials, and established clear performance standards. But within 6 months, 3 of my 5 instructors had quit, and the remaining 2 were actively looking for other opportunities. The breaking point came during what I thought would be a routine team meeting. I had prepared an agenda focused on improving our workshop delivery based on some student feedback I had received, but instead of collaborating on solutions, I found myself lecturing my team about what they were doing wrong and exactly how they should fix it. The problem, I announced with great confidence, is that you're not following the curriculum closely enough. Students are complaining about inconsistency between instructors, which means some of you are improvising instead of sticking to the proven methods I've developed. I then proceeded to outline a detailed plan for standardizing every aspect of their teaching approach. What I expected was grateful acknowledgement of my leadership and enthusiastic commitment to improvement. What I got was polite silence and barely concealed resentment. The meeting ended with perfunctory agreement, but I could sense something was fundamentally wrong with the dynamic. The truth became clear the following week when my most experienced instructor requested a private meeting. "Dale," she said, "I need to be honest with you about something. Your workshops are excellent, and your methods work. But working for you has become impossible because you don't trust us to think for ourselves. Every suggestion we make gets overruled. Every adaptation we try gets criticized. We feel like robots executing your program rather than professionals contributing to its success." Her words hit me like a physical blow because they revealed a pattern I hadn't recognized. My ego had convinced me that good leadership meant having all the answers and making all the decisions. I thought that if I could demonstrate my superior knowledge and strategic thinking, my team would naturally respect my authority and follow my direction. Instead, I had created an environment where capable people felt diminished and disempowered. I began to see how ego-driven leadership creates rebellion rather than loyalty. When leaders need to be the smartest person in the room, they rob their team members of opportunities to contribute their own intelligence. When leaders need to control every decision, they communicate that they don't trust their team's judgment. When leaders need to take credit for successes, they remove the intrinsic motivation that drives high performance. My ego had trapped me in what I came to call the dictator's paradox. The more I tried to control outcomes through authority and expertise, the less control I actually had over results. My team was following my instructions, but they weren't bringing their creativity, initiative, or passion to the work. They were doing exactly what I told them to, do nothing more, nothing less. The transformation began when I swallowed my pride and asked my team for their honest feedback about my leadership style. The conversation was painful but illuminating. They told me about feeling micromanaged and undervalued. They shared innovative ideas they had never mentioned because they assumed I wouldn't be interested in suggestions. They described the energy draining effect of working for someone who needed to be right about everything. But they also shared something that gave me hope. They believed in the work we were doing and wanted to contribute to its success. They had joined my team because they respected my expertise, but they had stayed despite my leadership style because they cared about helping people become better communicators. My ego had been solving the wrong problem instead of trying to prove my worth as a leader. I needed to create conditions where their worth could flourish. I began experimenting with a radically different approach. Instead of presenting solutions, I started presenting challenges and asking for their input. Instead of dictating methods, I established outcomes and invited them to develop their own approaches. Instead of correcting their techniques, I asked them to share what they were learning from their students. The results were immediate and remarkable. Team meetings became collaborative strategy sessions instead of one-way lectures. Instructors began bringing creative adaptations that improved our workshops while maintaining their core effectiveness. Student feedback improved because our instructors were more engaged and enthusiastic about their teaching. Most importantly, I discovered that true leadership isn't about being followed because you're superior, it's about being followed because you help others become superior versions of themselves. Though I lived in an era before social media, I often imagine how those platforms would have amplified my ego struggles to dangerous levels. When I consider the psychological mechanisms that drove my need for validation and approval, I can see exactly how I would have fallen into the modern traps of digital ego feeding that consumes so many people today. My ego was always hungry for evidence that I was impressive, valuable, and admired. In my time, this hunger drove me to dominate conversations, seek speaking opportunities, and constantly position myself as an expert. If I had access to social media, that same hunger would have had an endless buffet of validation opportunities, comments, shares, followers, all providing immediate feedback about my worth and importance. I can picture myself crafting the perfect post to showcase my latest accomplishment, carefully choosing photos that made my life look more exciting than it actually was, and obsessively checking for responses. The same ego that made me turn every conversation into a performance would have turned social media into a 24-hour theater where I was always on stage. The most dangerous aspect wouldn't have been the posting itself, but how the metrics would have become a measure of my worth. In real-world interactions, ego feedback is limited and often delayed. You might not know for days or weeks whether your performance impressed people, but social media provides instant gratification for ego-driven behavior. Every like would have been a small hit of validation, every comment a confirmation of my importance, every share proof of my value. I would have fallen into the comparison trap that social media makes so easy. Just as my ego used to measure my worth against others in person, I would have found myself comparing my posts to others, my follower count to theirs, my engagement to theirs. The same competitive ego that couldn't let someone else tell a good story without telling a better one would have been triggered by every successful post in my feed. Most insidiously, I would have started curating a version of myself that fed my ego rather than reflecting my authentic experience. The same way I used to carefully craft stories in social situations to make myself look good, I would have carefully crafted an online persona that showcased only my successes, insights, and impressive moments while hiding my struggles, failures, and ordinary human experiences. This curation creates a vicious cycle that I can see clearly from my historical perspective. The more you present a perfect version of yourself online, the more pressure you feel to maintain that image. The more validation you receive for your curated content, the more your ego becomes dependent on that external approval. You start living for the content rather than living your actual life. I think about how this would have affected my relationships. Just as my ego used to make me focus on being impressive rather than being interested in others, social media would have amplified this tendency. Instead of being present in conversations, I would have been thinking about how to turn the interaction into shareable content. Instead of listening deeply to friends' struggles, I would have been formulating the perfect advice to post publicly. The difference between sharing value and seeking validation would have become crucial. When I finally learned to set my ego aside, in real-world interactions, I discovered the joy of genuinely serving others rather than serving my image. Social media would have presented the same choice. I could use these platforms to help and encourage others, or I could use them to feed my ego's need for attention and admiration. I imagine I would have had to learn the same lesson digitally that I learned in person, that authentic connection requires vulnerability, not perfection. The posts that would have meant the most to others wouldn't have been my success announcements or wisdom proclamations, but my honest struggles and genuine questions. People connect with humanity, not with highlight reels. The key insight I would have needed to embrace is that social media platforms are tools that amplify whatever motivation drives your use of them. If you're driven by ego's need for validation, these tools become ego amplifiers that make you increasingly dependent on external approval. If you're driven by a genuine desire to serve and connect, these same tools can help you reach and encourage people you could never touch in person. The question isn't whether to use social media, but whether you can use it without letting it use you. Can you post without constantly checking for responses? Can you share your thoughts without measuring your worth by the engagement they receive? Can you celebrate others' successes without feeling diminished by them? Can you be honest about your struggles without turning them into performance art? These platforms would have forced me to confront the same fundamental question that all my ego struggles eventually led to. Am I seeking to serve others or to serve my image of myself? The difference between ego-driven false confidence and genuine confidence became crystal clear to me through one of the most humbling experiences of my early career. I had been invited to give what I thought would be a triumphant speech to a group of successful businessmen, and I prepared meticulously to impress them with my expertise and insights. I spent weeks crafting the perfect presentation, filled with sophisticated concepts and impressive examples from my work. I practiced my delivery until every gesture and pause was precisely timed. I selected my finest suit and arrived early to set up the room exactly as I wanted it. I was brimming with what I thought was confidence. I felt ready to dazzle my audience, but as I began speaking, something felt wrong. The audience seemed polite but disconnected. My carefully crafted jokes fell flat. My brilliant insights were met with blank stares. My impressive examples seemed to bore rather than inspire. By the middle of my speech, I could feel my confidence crumbling and panic began to set in. In that moment of crisis, my ego-driven confidence revealed its true nature. Instead of adapting to my audience's needs, I doubled down on my prepared material. Instead of connecting with them as human beings, I tried harder to impress them with my expertise. Instead of serving them, I desperately tried to save my performance. What I had thought was confidence was actually just elaborate preparation designed to protect my ego from the possibility of failure. The speech ended with polite but lukewarm applause, and I left feeling devastated. But that failure taught me something invaluable about the difference between false confidence and the real thing. False confidence depends on external validation and crumbles under pressure. Real confidence is rooted in something deeper and actually grows stronger when challenged. I began to understand that my previous confidence had been built on a foundation of comparison and performance. I felt confident when I was the smartest person in the room, when my material was perfectly prepared, when conditions were ideal for my success. But this kind of confidence was actually quite fragile because it depended on circumstances beyond my control. True confidence, I discovered, comes from a fundamentally different source. It's not based on being better than others, or having all the answers, or never making mistakes. Instead, it's based on trust in your ability to handle whatever happens, learn from whatever occurs, and grow through whatever challenges arise. The breakthrough came 6 months later when I was asked to speak to another group, this time with much less preparation time. Instead of trying to craft the perfect presentation, I decided to simply share what I'd learned from my previous failure. Instead of trying to impress them with my expertise, I focused on understanding what they needed and how I could serve them. This time, something magical happened. Because I wasn't protecting my ego, I could actually listen to my audience and respond to their energy. When I noticed confusion, I slowed down and explained more clearly. When I saw engagement, I explored topics more deeply. When someone asked a question I couldn't answer, I simply said, "I don't know, but that's a great question," and turned it back to the group for discussion. The response was completely different. People leaned in instead of checking out. They asked thoughtful questions instead of sitting passively. They approached me afterward not to compliment my expertise, but to continue conversations about topics that mattered to them. I had finally experienced what genuine confidence felt like. Real confidence, I learned, is paradoxical. It's humble enough to admit ignorance and strong enough to show vulnerability. It's secure enough to let others shine and wise enough to learn from anyone. It attracts people instead of repelling them because it makes others feel safe and valued rather than intimidated or diminished. Ego confidence says, "I need to prove I'm valuable." Genuine confidence says, "I am valuable, so I can focus on creating value for others." Ego confidence asks, "How can I look good?" Genuine confidence asks, "How can I be helpful?" Ego confidence measures success by comparison to others. Genuine confidence measures success by contribution to others. The most liberating aspect of genuine confidence is that it frees you from the exhausting work of image management. When your confidence comes from within rather than from others' opinions, you can afford to be authentic. You can admit when you're wrong, ask when you don't understand, and learn from people regardless of their status or credentials. This shift from ego confidence to genuine confidence transformed not just my speaking, but every aspect of my life. In business relationships, I stopped trying to be the smartest person in the room and started trying to ask the smartest questions. In social situations, I stopped performing my personality and started simply being present with others. In challenging situations, I stopped defending my position and started exploring what I could learn. Genuine confidence gave me something that ego confidence never could: the ability to fail without being destroyed, to be criticized without being devastated, and to succeed without becoming arrogant. It provided a stable foundation that couldn't be shaken by external circumstances because it wasn't dependent on them. Asterisk. There was one moment in my life when I had to choose between my ego and a relationship that mattered deeply to me. And that choice taught me more about the power of genuine apology than years of study ever could. The relationship was with my business partner, Thomas, and the incident that nearly destroyed our partnership revealed just how destructive my ego could be. When it felt threatened, we had been working together for 2 years, building a successful training business. When we disagreed about expanding into a new market, Thomas believed we should focus on perfecting our current offerings, while I was convinced we needed to diversify quickly to stay ahead of competitors. What started as a strategic discussion escalated into something much more personal and damaging. During one particularly heated meeting, Thomas questioned whether I had really thought through the financial implications of my expansion plan. My ego heard this not as a legitimate business concern, but as an attack on my competence and judgment. Instead of addressing his actual questions, I responded by questioning his ambition and vision, suggesting that his cautious approach would keep us small and irrelevant. "You're so focused on playing it safe," I said with barely concealed frustration, "that you can't see the opportunities right in front of us. Sometimes I wonder if you really want this business to succeed, or if you're content with mediocrity." The words came out more harshly than I intended, but my ego was in full defensive mode. I watched Thomas's face change as I spoke. The collaborative partner I had worked with for years was replaced by someone who looked hurt and angry. "Dale," he said quietly, "I've never questioned your commitment to this business, and I don't appreciate you questioning mine. I'm raising practical concerns, not opposing your vision." But instead of backing down and acknowledging that I had crossed a line, my ego doubled down. I spent the next 10 minutes explaining why my concerns about his lack of vision were valid, providing examples of his overly cautious decisions, and justifying my harsh words as necessary honesty. By the time I finished, Thomas had stopped arguing back. He simply said, "I think we both need some time to cool off," and left. For 3 days, we worked in the same office without really speaking. The tension was unbearable, but my ego convinced me that I was in the right and that Thomas should be the one to apologize. After all, hadn't he questioned my judgment first? Wasn't I just responding to his attack? My ego spun an elaborate narrative where I was the wronged party, patiently waiting for him to acknowledge his mistake. But late on the third night, alone in my office, I finally forced myself to confront what had actually happened. Thomas had raised legitimate business questions, and I had responded by attacking his character and commitment. He had been professional and collaborative, while I had been defensive and personal. My ego had transformed a normal business disagreement into a relationship-threatening conflict. Writing that apology letter was one of the hardest things I had ever done. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because my ego fought me every step of the way. It wanted me to craft a pseudo-apology that acknowledged some blame while making sure Thomas understood his role in the conflict. It wanted me to apologize for my tone while defending the substance of what I had said. But I knew that kind of half apology would make things worse, not better. A real apology required taking full responsibility for my behavior without deflecting any blame onto him. It meant acknowledging the impact of my words without justifying them. It meant being vulnerable enough to admit I had been wrong completely. And without qualification, the letter I finally wrote was short and direct. "Thomas, I owe you a sincere apology. I was wrong to question your commitment to our business, and I was wrong to let my frustration turn into a personal attack. You raised legitimate concerns about my expansion plan, and instead of addressing them professionally, I got defensive and said things that were hurtful and unfair. I value our partnership and our friendship, and I'm sorry for damaging both with my behavior. You deserved better from me." Delivering that letter was terrifying because I had no idea how Thomas would respond. My ego warned me that apologizing would make me look weak, that it would shift the power dynamic in our partnership, that it would encourage him to question my judgment in the future. But what actually happened was the opposite of everything my ego had predicted. Thomas's response was immediate and gracious. He thanked me for the apology, acknowledged that the conflict had been difficult for him too, and suggested we sit down to discuss both the expansion question and how we could handle future disagreements more constructively. But more importantly, something fundamental shifted in our relationship. Instead of making me appear weak, the apology had actually strengthened his respect for me. That experience taught me that genuine apology is one of the most powerful tools for building relationships, but only when it's free from ego's contamination. Ego-driven apologies are actually manipulations designed to restore your image while avoiding real responsibility. They use phrases like "I'm sorry if you were hurt" instead of "I'm sorry I hurt you," or "I apologize for my tone" instead of "I apologize for what I said." Real apology requires setting ego aside completely and focusing entirely on the impact of your actions on the other person. It means being more concerned with their healing than with your image, more focused on restoring the relationship than on protecting your reputation. I kept a detailed chart of opportunities I had lost due to ego-driven decisions, and the pattern that emerged was both clear and devastating. My ego hadn't just damaged my relationships, it had systematically sabotaged my professional success by making me focus on looking successful instead of being successful. The most expensive example occurred during negotiations for what could have been the largest contract of my early career. A major corporation had invited me to propose a comprehensive training program for their entire sales force, hundreds of people across multiple locations. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I had been working toward for years, but during the final presentation, my ego took control in the most destructive way possible. When the executives began asking detailed questions about implementation challenges, instead of admitting the limitations of my experience with programs of this scale, I found myself claiming expertise I didn't actually possess. How would you handle the logistical challenges of training teams in 12 different cities simultaneously? One executive asked. Instead of honestly saying, "That's a great question, and I'd need to research the best approaches for managing that complexity," my ego jumped in with, "I've handled similar challenges many times before. The key is establishing standardized protocols and clear communication channels." The truth was, I had never managed anything close to that scale, and my vague answer revealed my inexperience to anyone who was really listening. But my ego was so committed to appearing competent that it kept digging the hole deeper with each question. When they asked about measuring training effectiveness across diverse markets, I invented metrics I had never actually used. When they inquired about adapting content for different regional cultures, I described approaches I had read about but never implemented. By the end of the meeting, I had painted myself as someone with vastly more experience than I actually had. A week later, I received the rejection call. The executive was diplomatic but clear. "Dale, your ideas have merit, but we need someone with proven experience managing programs of this scope. We got the sense that you might be taking on more than you've handled before." I had lost the contract not because I lacked the ability to deliver excellent training, but because my ego had prevented me from being honest about what I would need to learn to deliver it successfully. This painful experience forced me to confront a pattern I had been blind to. My ego was making me focus on appearing successful, rather than actually becoming successful. Instead of admitting knowledge gaps so I could fill them, I was pretending they didn't exist. Instead of learning from people I considered beneath me in status, I was dismissing their insights to maintain my superior position. I began to see how ego creates a learning disability that becomes more severe as you advance in your career. Early in my journey, when it was obvious that I had much to learn, my ego was less threatened by admitting ignorance. But as I gained some expertise and recognition, my ego became increasingly invested in maintaining the image of someone who had already figured everything out. This dynamic was particularly destructive, because the challenges that come with greater success require continuous learning and adaptation. The ego that helps you feel confident in your abilities can become the same ego that prevents you from developing new abilities. It creates a success ceiling that becomes lower as your ego's need to appear competent becomes stronger. I started paying attention to the most successful people I knew, and I discovered something remarkable. They were the quickest to admit what they didn't know, and the most eager to learn from anyone who could teach them something valuable. Their success hadn't made them more ego-driven, it had made them more humble, because they understood that sustained success requires constant growth. The breakthrough came when I began to separate my identity from my knowledge. Instead of thinking, I am someone who knows about training and development, I started thinking, I am someone who is passionate about learning how to help people grow. This shift freed me to admit ignorance without feeling like I was diminishing my worth. I started saying things like, I don't have experience with that, but I'd love to learn about your approach, and that's outside my expertise, but it sounds fascinating. Can you tell me more? Instead of making me appear incompetent, this honesty made me more attractive as a partner and collaborator, because people could trust that I was being genuine about my capabilities. My business began to grow much faster once I stopped pretending to know things I didn't know. Clients trusted me more because they could rely on my assessments of what I could and couldn't deliver. Partners wanted to work with me because I was curious about their expertise rather than competitive with it. Students learned more from me because I was modeling the humility and openness that real learning requires. Perhaps most importantly, I started attracting opportunities that actually matched my abilities rather than opportunities I had to fake my way through. When you're honest about your strengths and limitations, people can make good decisions about when and how to work with you. When you pretend to be something you're not, you end up in situations where failure is almost inevitable. The irony is that ego, which promises to help you succeed by making you appear more capable than you are, actually limits your success by preventing you from becoming more capable than you are. True confidence in business comes not from having all the answers, but from knowing you can find the answers you need. It comes not from never making mistakes, but from learning quickly when you do. Setting ego aside didn't make me less ambitious or competitive. It made me more effectively ambitious and competitive. Instead of competing to look the smartest, I competed to learn the fastest. Instead of trying to impress people with what I already knew, I tried to serve them by discovering what they needed me to know. The most powerful insight of my career came when I realized that the same energy my ego used for self-protection could be redirected into genuine influence. Instead of using my intelligence to make myself look important, I could use it to make others feel important. Instead of using my knowledge to elevate myself above others, I could use it to elevate others above their current circumstances. This transformation began with one of my most successful students, a young woman named Margaret, who attended my public speaking classes. When she first arrived, she was paralyzed by fear and convinced she had nothing valuable to say. My old ego-driven approach would have been to impress her with my expertise and give her brilliant advice about overcoming her fears. But I was learning to approach teaching differently. Instead of making myself the center of attention, I made her the center of attention. Instead of showing her how much I knew about public speaking, I became genuinely curious about what she had experienced in her life that might inspire others. Instead of trying to fix her fear, I helped her discover the passion that was stronger than her fear. Through careful questioning, I learned that Margaret had overcome tremendous personal challenges to build a small business that supported other single mothers in her community. She had stories of resilience, creativity, and compassion that could move any audience, but she had never considered them worth sharing because they seemed ordinary. To her, my role wasn't to give her my wisdom, was to help her recognize her own wisdom. I didn't need to make her respect my expertise, needed to help her respect her own experience. The transformation was remarkable, not just in her speaking ability, but in her entire presence and confidence. 6 months later, Margaret was not only speaking confidently to groups, but had started her own workshop series for women entrepreneurs. She thanked me for teaching her, but I knew the truth. I had simply created space for her own knowledge and passion to emerge. The influence I had gained with her wasn't because I had proven myself superior, but because I had helped her discover her own superiority. This experience taught me the fundamental difference between ego-driven leadership and genuine influence. Ego-driven leadership says, "Follow me because I'm impressive." Genuine influence says, "Let me help you become impressive." Ego-driven leadership creates dependence. People need you because you have what they lack. Genuine influence creates independence. People grow beyond their need for you because you've helped them develop what they already possessed. I began to understand that real influence comes from empowerment, not domination. When you use your abilities to make others feel small, you may gain temporary compliance, but you lose long-term loyalty. When you use your abilities to make others feel capable, you gain something much more valuable: people who voluntarily choose to follow your leadership because they associate you with their own growth and success. The energy shift was remarkable. Instead of spending mental energy on positioning myself above others, I could focus entirely on lifting others up. Instead of competing with everyone around me, I could collaborate with them toward shared goals. Instead of defending my importance, I could invest in making others important. This approach transformed every aspect of my professional relationships. In business meetings, instead of trying to have the best ideas, I focused on asking the best questions that would help others discover great ideas. In social situations, instead of trying to be the most interesting person in the room, I became the most interested person in the room. In teaching situations, instead of trying to impress students with my knowledge, I worked to help them access their own wisdom. The results were everything my ego had always wanted but could never achieve through self-promotion. People began seeking my advice, not because I was the smartest person they knew, but because conversations with me helped them think more clearly. They recommended me for opportunities, not because I was obviously impressive, but because I had a track record of helping others become impressive. They trusted me with important decisions, not because I always had the right answers, but because I had a gift for helping them find the right answers. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. The exhausting work of ego maintenance, constantly monitoring how I appeared to others, carefully managing my image, defensively protecting my reputation, was replaced by the energizing work of genuine service. Instead of taking energy from interactions, I began gaining energy from them. I discovered that when you make others feel important, you automatically become important to them. When you help others succeed, you become associated with success in their minds. When you empower others, they naturally want to empower you in return. The influence I had been chasing through ego-driven behavior came naturally once I stopped chasing it and started focusing on creating value for others. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it required constant vigilance against my ego's attempts to reclaim control. Even now, I have to catch myself when I start to focus more on being impressive than on being helpful. But the rewards of genuine influence, deeper relationships, sustainable success, and the knowledge that you're making a meaningful contribution to others' lives make the ongoing effort worthwhile. The student who taught me the most about this transformation was actually myself. As I learned to redirect my ego energy into service, I discovered capabilities I never knew I possessed. My creativity flourished when it was focused on solving others' problems rather than showcasing my cleverness. My communication improved when it was focused on clarity rather than complexity. My leadership developed when it was focused on empowerment rather than control. Asterisk. Managing ego isn't a one-time transformation. It's a daily practice that requires constant attention and deliberate effort. I developed a personal system for keeping my ego in check, and I want to share the specific techniques that made the difference between occasional insights and lasting change. My morning routine became crucial for setting the right intention for each day. Before getting dressed or eating breakfast, I would spend 10 minutes with what I called my daily ego check. I would sit quietly and ask myself 3 fundamental questions that helped orient my mindset away from ego-driven behavior. The first question was, how can I serve others today instead of serving my image? This question forced me to shift from a self-focused mindset to an other-focused mindset before I even left the house. Instead of thinking about how to look good in meetings, I would think about how to make the meetings more valuable for everyone involved. Instead of planning how to showcase my expertise, I would consider how to learn something from each person I encountered. The second question was, what am I trying to prove today? And can I let go of needing to prove it? This question helped me identify the ego agendas I was carrying into the day. Was I trying to prove I was smarter than a colleague? Was I trying to prove my worth to a potential client? Was I trying to prove my importance to my team? Once I identified these hidden agendas, I could consciously choose to release them. The third question was, what would I do differently today if I wasn't worried about how others perceive me? This question revealed how much of my planned behavior was driven by image management rather than authentic purpose. It helped me distinguish between actions that served my ego and actions that served my genuine goals. But morning intention setting was only half of the system. The real work happened throughout the day as I learned to recognize ego rising in real-time conversations. I developed what I called ego alerts, physical and emotional signals that warned me when my ego was taking control. The first alert was a feeling of heat in my face when someone disagreed with me or questioned my ideas. Instead of immediately defending my position, I learned to pause and ask myself, am I defending this idea because it's right or because it's mine? This pause gave me space to separate my ego from my intellect and respond more thoughtfully. The second alert was a sudden urge to one-up someone's story or accomplishment. When someone shared good news and I felt the immediate impulse to share bigger news of my own, I learned to catch myself and instead ask questions that would help them savor their moment. That must feel incredible. Tell me more about how you achieved that. The third alert was the feeling of being misunderstood or underappreciated. When I felt like someone wasn't recognizing my value or contribution, instead of trying to correct their perception, I would ask myself, what do they need right now, and how can I provide it? This shifted my focus from getting recognition to giving value. My evening routine was equally important for learning from my daily ego encounters. Before going to bed, I would review the day and identify moments when my ego had taken control despite my morning intentions. This wasn't about self-criticism, it was about building awareness, so I could catch these patterns earlier in the future. I would ask myself, when did I make conversations about me instead of the other person? When did I try to look smart instead of being helpful? When did I defend my image instead of acknowledging a mistake? This honest reflection helped me see patterns I was blind to in the moment, but I also celebrated moments when I had successfully set ego aside. When did I ask a great question instead of giving a lecture? When did I admit ignorance instead of pretending to know? When did I make someone else feel important instead of trying to appear important myself? These positive reinforcements helped strengthen the ego-free behaviors I wanted to cultivate. The most challenging part of daily ego management was dealing with situations that triggered my deepest insecurities. When I felt truly threatened or vulnerable, my ego would fight harder to regain control. I learned to prepare for these situations by identifying my triggers in advance and planning specific responses. If I knew I was going into a meeting where my expertise might be questioned, I would prepare not just my technical material, but my emotional response. I would remind myself that questions weren't attacks, that admitting uncertainty wasn't weakness, and that learning from others wasn't defeat. If I was entering a social situation where I might feel insecure or inferior, I would set an intention to be curious about others rather than impressive to them. I would prepare specific questions I could ask to draw people out rather than trying to think of stories that would make me look good. The daily practice also included what I called ego recovery, what to do when I caught myself falling back into ego-driven behavior. Instead of feeling guilty or defeated, I learned to simply acknowledge what had happened and redirect. I notice I just made that conversation about let me ask you a question about your experience. This gentle course correction became more natural with practice. Over time, this daily practice created a new default way of being. Instead of having to consciously fight my ego in every interaction, ego-free behavior began to feel natural and automatic. The energy I had been spending on image management was freed up for genuine connection and authentic contribution. The key insight was that ego management isn't about perfection, it's about awareness and course correction. Every day offers dozens of small opportunities to choose service over self-promotion, curiosity over competition, and authenticity over image. The daily practice simply helps you recognize these opportunities and make better choices when they arise. No relationship exposed the destructive power of my ego quite like my marriage. While I could sometimes mask my ego-driven behavior in professional settings, the intimacy and daily proximity of marriage made it impossible to hide from my wife, Dorothy. The ways that my need to be right was slowly poisoning our connection. The pattern had developed so gradually that I didn't recognize it at first. In our early years together, Dorothy would share concerns or frustrations about our life together, and I would immediately jump into problem-solving mode. When she worried about our finances, I would explain our budget and investment strategy. When she felt overwhelmed by household responsibilities, I would propose efficiency systems. When she expressed doubts about social situations, I would give her advice on confidence and conversation. I thought I was being a helpful, supportive husband. Dorothy experienced something entirely different. After 3 years of marriage, she finally confronted me with words that changed everything. Dale, I don't need you to fix my feelings or solve my problems. When I share something with you, I'm not asking for a consultant, I'm asking for a partner who can simply be with me in whatever I'm experiencing. But even that direct feedback triggered my ego's defensive response. Instead of listening to what she was telling me about her needs, I found myself explaining why my approach was actually helpful and why she should appreciate having a husband who cared enough to offer solutions. I was so focused on defending my method of showing love that I completely missed her request for a different kind of love. The crisis point came during an argument about something trivial. I can't even remember what started it, but it escalated into something much deeper. Dorothy was expressing frustration about feeling unheard in our relationship, and I was responding with logical explanations of why her perception was incorrect. We were both getting increasingly frustrated, and the conversation was spiraling out of control. Then Dorothy said something that stopped me cold. Dale, you're so busy being right that you can't afford to be married. You turn every conversation into a debate that you have to win, even when winning means I have to lose. I'm tired of being wrong in my own marriage. Those words hit me like a physical blow because they revealed a pattern I had been blind to. I was keeping score in our relationship, and the score was always Dale, right, Dorothy, wrong. My ego had convinced me that being right was more important than being connected, that winning arguments was more valuable than winning trust, that proving my point was more crucial than proving my love. I began to notice how ego manifested in the smallest daily interactions. When Dorothy would tell a story about her day, I would correct minor details instead of simply enjoying her sharing. When she would express an opinion about something, I would immediately explain why a different perspective was more accurate. When she would make a decision I disagreed with, I would launch into educational lectures about better approaches. My ego had turned me into a husband who was always teaching rather than learning, always correcting rather than connecting, always improving rather than appreciating. I was so focused on being the smart one in the relationship that I had forgotten how to be the loving one. The transformation began when I forced myself to have an honest conversation with Dorothy about how my behavior was affecting her. Instead of defending myself or explaining my intentions, I simply asked her to help me understand her experience of being married to me. What she shared was devastating and illuminating. She felt like she was living with a critic rather than a companion. She had stopped sharing certain thoughts and feelings because she was tired of having them analyzed and corrected. She felt like she had to be perfect to earn my approval, and imperfect expressions of herself were treated as problems to be solved, rather than parts of herself to be loved. "I married you because you were brilliant and passionate," she said, "but somewhere along the way, you started using your brilliance against me instead of for our relationship. I don't need you to be smarter than me, need you to be on my side." Learning to be wrong gracefully in marriage became one of the most important skills I ever developed. When Dorothy would point out something I had done that hurt her feelings, instead of explaining why she shouldn't feel hurt, I learned to simply say, "I'm sorry I hurt you. Help me understand how I can do better." When we disagreed about decisions, instead of proving why my way was superior, I learned to ask, "What's most important to you about this? And how can we find an approach that honors what we both care about?" This shift from winning to collaborating transformed our conflicts from competitions into conversations. But the deepest change came when I realized that vulnerability and ego cannot coexist in a relationship. Real intimacy requires the ability to be seen completely, including your fears, insecurities, and mistakes. But ego is always working to hide these very aspects of yourself because they threaten the image you're trying to maintain. I had to learn to share my struggles with Dorothy instead of pretending I had everything figured out. I had to admit when I was scared or uncertain instead of projecting confidence about everything. I had to ask for her support instead of always positioning myself as the one who provided support. This vulnerability initially felt terrifying because my ego warned me that showing weakness would make Dorothy respect me less. But the opposite happened. As I became more honest about my humanity, she felt safer sharing her own humanity. As I stopped trying to be perfect, she felt permission to be imperfect. As I admitted my need for her, she felt valued for who she was rather than criticized for who she wasn't. The marriage that emerged from this transformation was entirely different from the one we had started with. Instead of two people competing to be right, we became two people committed to getting it right together. Instead of one person always teaching and the other always learning, we became partners who could teach and learn from each other. Instead of love that depended on performance, we created love that was safe enough for authenticity. Learning to share knowledge without bruising egos became one of the most valuable skills I ever developed, and it transformed me from someone who was technically correct but relationally ineffective into someone who could actually help people grow and change. The breakthrough came when I realized that how you deliver truth matters more than the truth itself when it comes to creating lasting change in others. I learned this lesson through a painful failure with one of my most promising students, a young man named William who had tremendous potential as a public speaker, but several distracting habits that undermined his effectiveness. He would pace nervously, speak too quickly when he got excited, and had a tendency to repeat himself when he felt the audience wasn't understanding his points. My old approach would have been direct and comprehensive. I would have taken William aside after his presentation and given him a thorough analysis of everything he needed to improve. "William, you need to plant your feet and stop pacing. You're speaking too fast in the emotional sections Slow down and let your words land. And you repeated your main point 3 times in the last 5 minutes, which makes you sound unsure of yourself. I thought I was being helpful by giving him specific, actionable feedback. What I didn't realize was that my ego was driving me to demonstrate my expertise by showing him everything I could see that he couldn't see about his own performance. I was more focused on proving my value as a teacher than on preserving his confidence as a learner. William's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed, his posture became defensive, and I could see him mentally preparing rebuttals to my feedback. Instead of feeling grateful for the insights, he felt attacked and criticized. The next week, he approached, speaking with visible anxiety, second-guessing every movement and word choice. My helpful feedback had made him worse, not better. That failure taught me that direct correction triggers defensive responses because it threatens people's self-image and competence. When you tell someone what they're doing wrong, their ego immediately springs into action to protect them from feeling foolish or inadequate. All their mental energy goes into defending themselves rather than absorbing the lesson you're trying to teach. I began experimenting with what I came to call gentle teaching approaches that helped people discover improvements themselves rather than having improvements imposed upon them. Instead of telling William he was pacing, I asked him how he felt about his physical presence during the speech. Instead of correcting his speed, I asked him to notice which parts of his presentation felt rushed to him. The difference was remarkable. When William identified his own areas for improvement, he felt empowered rather than criticized. When he discovered his patterns himself, he was motivated to change them rather than defensive about them. The same feedback that had triggered resistance, when delivered directly, was embraced when discovered personally. I developed several specific techniques for delivering feedback that built people up instead of tearing them down. The first was what I called the sandwich approach, beginning with something the person did well, addressing one specific area for improvement, and ending with encouragement about their progress or potential. But even more important than the structure was the spirit behind the feedback. I learned to approach each teaching moment with genuine curiosity about the person's experience rather than judgment about their performance. Instead of thinking, "Here's what you did wrong," I would think, "I wonder what you noticed about that interaction and how I can help you see it even more clearly." The most powerful technique I discovered was asking questions that led people to their own insights. Instead of saying you need to make more eye contact with your audience, I would ask, what did you notice about your connection with different parts of the audience? Instead of saying your conclusion was weak, I would ask, how did you feel about the energy in the room during your closing? These questions accomplished something that direct correction never could. They made people partners in their own improvement rather than passive recipients of criticism. They maintained dignity while promoting growth, preserved confidence while encouraging change. I watched this approach transform not just individual students, but entire learning environments. When people felt safe to acknowledge their own areas for improvement, they became more open to feedback from others. When they weren't worried about defending themselves from criticism, they could focus entirely on learning and growing. One of my most successful students was actually someone who had initially struggled with defensiveness. Sarah had great content and genuine passion, but she became argumentative whenever anyone questioned her ideas. Using the gentle teaching approach, I helped her discover that her defensiveness was actually undermining the very points she was trying to make. Instead of telling her she was being defensive, I asked her to reflect on how the audience was responding to her rebuttals of their questions. Instead of criticizing her argumentative tone, I helped her notice the difference in energy when she responded to challenges with curiosity versus resistance. The transformation was remarkable, not just in her speaking, but in her entire approach to difficult conversations. The key insight was that people resist being taught, but love discovering. They reject being corrected, but embrace being understood. They defend against criticism, but welcome exploration. When you can shift from delivering truth to facilitating discovery, you become the kind of teacher people actually want to learn from. This approach required setting my ego aside completely, because it meant I couldn't take credit for people's improvements. When students discovered their own areas for growth, they owned the insights in a way that made change inevitable. When they felt empowered rather than criticized, they became advocates for their own development rather than resistors of my feedback. Teaching without triggering ego isn't just about being nice, it's about being effective. The most brilliant insights in the world are worthless if they're delivered in ways that make people unable to hear them. But when you learn to help people save face while growing, you become someone they seek out for guidance rather than someone they avoid for fear of criticism. Years after I began practicing ego-free living, I started receiving letters that revealed the true impact of setting ego aside. These weren't just thank you notes for my teaching or business advice. They were testimonies to how ego-free interactions had changed people's lives in ways I never could have imagined when I was focused on managing my own image. One letter came from Margaret, the student I had helped discover her own wisdom years earlier. She wrote, "Dale, I wanted you to know that the way you believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself started a chain reaction that continues to this day. The confidence I gained from your class led me to start my business, which led to speaking opportunities, which led to meeting my husband at a conference. But more than that, I learned from watching you how to help others find their own strength. Instead of trying to impress them with mine, I've used that approach with my own employees, and several of them have started their own successful ventures." Reading that letter, I realized that ego-free living creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate interaction. When you help someone discover their own worth instead of trying to prove your own worth, you don't just change that moment, you change how they approach every future interaction, where they have the opportunity to lift someone else up. Another powerful letter came from Thomas, my former business partner. He wrote, "The apology you gave me 15 years ago taught me more about leadership than any business book I've ever read. Not just because you took responsibility, but because of how it changed our working relationship afterward. You showed me that admitting mistakes doesn't make you weak, it makes you trustworthy." I've carried that lesson into every business relationship since, and it's been the foundation of whatever success I've achieved. I began to understand that humility is remembered long after ego is forgotten. People forget what you said to impress them, but they remember how you made them feel about themselves. They may not recall the brilliant advice you gave them, but they'll never forget the moment you helped them realize they had their own brilliance to offer. The business relationships that flourished after I set my ego aside created a compound effect that amazed me. When you stop competing with your colleagues and start collaborating with them, they begin to see you as someone who enhances their success rather than threatens it. This led to referrals, partnerships, and opportunities that never would have come my way when I was focused on outshining everyone around me. A client wrote, "Working with you was different from any other consultant we've hired. Most come in trying to prove how smart they are by showing us everything we're doing wrong. You came in trying to understand what we were already doing right and how to build on it." That approach didn't just solve our immediate problem, taught our team how to approach challenges with curiosity instead of criticism. These letters revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated while I was going through my ego transformation. People were watching how I handled criticism, how I responded to being wrong, how I treated people who couldn't benefit me professionally. They were learning not just from what I taught, but from how I lived. A former employee shared, "You probably don't remember this, but 5 years ago, in a team meeting, someone challenged one of your ideas pretty aggressively. Instead of getting defensive, you said, 'That's a great point. Help me understand your thinking.' That response completely changed the energy in the room and led to our best solution. But more than that, it showed me how to handle criticism in my own leadership role. I've used that approach countless times since. The compound effect of ego-free interactions became most clear when I looked at the relationships I had maintained over decades. The people I had served instead of impressed had become not just professional contacts, but genuine friends who enriched my life in ways that had nothing to do with business. The students I had empowered instead of dazzled had become colleagues who sought my input on important decisions. The partners I had collaborated with instead of competed against had become advocates who recommended me for opportunities I never would have learned about otherwise. Perhaps most meaningfully, the approach I had learned in professional settings had transformed my personal relationships as well. My marriage had deepened because Dorothy felt safe to be vulnerable with someone who wouldn't use her openness against her. My friendships had become more authentic because people knew they could share struggles with me without receiving lectures about what they should do differently. I realized that ego-free living had given me something that ego-driven living never could: the knowledge that I was making a meaningful contribution to others' lives rather than just advancing my own agenda. When your focus shifts from getting people to think well of you to helping people think well of themselves, you discover a form of satisfaction that no amount of personal recognition can provide. The legacy letters taught me that the most important influence you have isn't the advice you give people, that's the example you set for how to treat others when you have power over them, how you respond when criticized, how you behave when you're the expert in the room, how you treat people who can't help your career. These moments reveal your character and teach others how to use their own power and influence. Looking back on decades of ego-free living, I can see that it wasn't just a better way to build relationships, it was a better way to build a life. When you're not constantly defending your image, you have energy to invest in meaningful work. When you're not competing with everyone around you, you can enjoy other people's successes. When you're not trying to prove your worth, you can focus on creating actual worth. The greatest legacy of a life without ego isn't the recognition you receive, it's the recognition you help others achieve. It's not the success you accumulate, the success you make possible for others. It's not being remembered as someone who was impressive, it's being remembered as someone who made others feel impressive about themselves. Asterisk, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey of ego examination and transformation, you're ready to begin your own liberation from the invisible prison that has been holding you back from the relationships, success, and fulfillment you truly desire. But knowing about ego and actually defeating it are two very different things. What matters now is not what you understand, but what you do with that understanding starting today. Let me give you the specific steps to begin your ego transformation immediately, based on everything I've learned through decades of personal struggle and observation. These aren't theoretical principles, they're practical tools that will help you catch ego in action and choose a different response. First, start with the daily ego check I described earlier, but modify it for your specific circumstances. Each morning, before you engage with other people, ask yourself, what am I trying to prove today? Write down whatever comes to mind. Maybe you want to prove you're competent to your boss, impressive to a colleague, or write about a decision you made. Simply identifying these ego agendas removes half their power over you. Asterisk second, choose one specific ego behavior to focus on changing this week. Don't try to transform everything at once. That's actually an ego-driven approach that sets you up for failure. Instead, pick one pattern, maybe interrupting others to share your own stories, maybe getting defensive when criticized, maybe needing to have the last word in arguments. Focus all your attention on catching yourself in that one behavior and choosing differently. Third, identify your personal ego alerts the physical and emotional signals that warn you when ego is taking control. For me, it was heat in my face when challenged. For you, it might be a tightness in your chest when someone gets more attention, or a surge of irritation when someone questions your ideas. Learn to recognize these signals as early warning systems rather than calls to action. Fourth, practice the art of genuine apology in low-stakes situations. When you make a minor mistake, arriving late, forgetting someone's name, giving incorrect information, resist the urge to explain or justify. Simply say, "I apologize for that," and move on. This builds your capacity for taking responsibility without defending your image. Fifth, experiment with being wrong gracefully in conversations that don't matter much to you. When someone corrects a small factual error or suggests a different approach to something minor, try responding with "you're absolutely right," or "that's a much better way to think about it." Notice how this response affects both your internal state and the other person's reaction to you. But perhaps most importantly, start building a support system for ego-free living. Share this journey with someone you trust, spouse, close friend, or mentor, and ask them to lovingly point out when they see your ego taking control. Most people are too polite to mention ego-driven behavior, but if you specifically request this feedback, you'll get invaluable insights into patterns you can't see yourself. Now, let me challenge you based on everything we've covered together. I challenge you to go one full week treating every interaction as an opportunity to make the other person feel important, rather than making yourself look important. I challenge you to ask more questions than you answer, to listen more than you speak, to learn more than you teach. I challenge you to catch yourself the next time you're about to correct someone's minor mistake or improve upon their idea. And instead ask yourself, will saying this serve them or serve my ego? I challenge you to notice when you're about to share your own story in response to someone else's story, and instead ask a question that helps them tell their story more fully. Most importantly, I challenge you to remember that people will forget what you said to impress them, but they'll remember how you made them feel about themselves. They'll forget your clever comebacks and brilliant insights, but they'll remember the moment you helped them feel heard, valued, and important. The world that awaits you when you defeat your biggest enemy is more beautiful than anything your ego ever promised you. When you're not constantly defending your image, you have energy to invest in meaningful relationships. When you're not competing with everyone around you, you can collaborate toward goals that matter. When you're not trying to prove your worth, you can focus on creating genuine worth. You'll discover that the influence you've been chasing through ego-driven behavior comes naturally when you stop chasing it and start focusing on serving others. You'll find that the respect you've been demanding is freely given when you stop demanding it and start earning it through humility and authenticity. You'll learn that the success you've been pursuing feels hollow when achieved through ego, but deeply satisfying when achieved through service. Your ego-free future doesn't start tomorrow or next week. It starts with the very next interaction. You have the very next conversation is an opportunity to choose curiosity over competition, service over self-promotion, authenticity over image management. The person you talk to next is waiting to be seen, heard, and valued by someone who isn't trying to prove anything. I have given you the keys to the prison that has been holding you back from the life you truly want. The door is unlocked. The only question that remains is whether you'll have the courage to walk through it and discover who you really are when you're not performing for an audience, competing for validation, or defending an image. The battle against your ego will never be completely won. It's a daily choice, a moment-by-moment decision to serve rather than be served, to empower rather than impress, to connect rather than compete. But every victory in this battle makes you more free, more authentic, and more genuinely powerful than you ever were when your ego was in control. Your ego-free future starts now. The person you were meant to be is waiting on the other side of this transformation, and the world needs that person, not the performing, competing, defending version of yourself, but the authentic, humble, service-oriented person who emerges when ego is finally defeated. Begin today. Your relationships, your success, and your soul are depending on it.